As a result of the Ukraine war, we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And we have this situation today where Russia and China are close allies, which is not in America's strategic interest. The multipolar world after 2017, the United States had to focus on great power competition. And of course, it abandoned, in large part, its mission of trying to remake the world in its own image, because not only had it failed, but there were more important issues on the table than spreading liberal democracy. And the more important issues involved great power competition. He wants U.S.-Russian relations to improve so he can peel the Russians away from the Chinese. By the way, this is a situation that's similar to what Kissinger and Nixon did
It's
in
the other way around.
1972. Well, I think from roughly 1992, shortly after the Soviet Union disappeared, and of course the Cold War had ended at that point in time, up until about 2017, when China and Russia emerged as great powers, we lived in the unipolar world. And by definition, you cannot have security competition in a unipolar world because there's only one great power. Uh, but eventually, I think everybody recognized that new great powers would appear and we'd leave unipolarity. My argument is that this happened in about 2017, when China and Russia came on the scene as great powers. So, starting in about 2017 and up to the present, we moved into a multipolar world, and great power competition was back on the table. Now, hardly anybody anticipated that there would be trouble once we left unipolarity and moved to multipolarity. They thought that peaceful relations among the great powers was forever. And it didn't matter if we left unipolarity. I, of course, disagreed with that completely. And I thought that the rise of China and China becoming a great power would lead to all sorts of trouble in East Asia. And there would be an intense security competition between the United States and China in that region. Most people thought that I was foolish, that this was a ridiculous argument. Sadly, I believe I've been proved correct there. And with regard to Europe, I long argued that trying to expand, especially into Ukraine, was a prescription for disaster. It would lead to trouble with Russia. And of course, this trouble started even before Russia became a great power once again. The conflict in Ukraine, you want to remember, broke out in 2014, which was during the unipolar moment. And in my argument, it wasn't until about 2017 that Russia was a great power again. But regardless, the point is that we now have this terrible conflict in Ukraine between the West on one side and Russia on the other side. And of course, Ukraine is allied with the West. And again, there, most people thought that we could expand NATO eastward and get away with it, that it wouldn't lead to conflict. And again, I'm sad to say that I was correct on that one as well. I know it's commonplace for people to argue that this is a retreat from global leadership and that the United States is pursuing or moving toward an isolationist foreign policy. This is nonsense. This is not what's happening. What's happening is what you described. During the unipolar moment, there was no great power competition, as I emphasized before. And what the United States decided to do instead of engaging in great power competition was to remake the world in its own image, to pursue a very liberal foreign policy, what I call liberal hegemony. And the end result of this is we got into the forever wars. It was disastrous. And as a result, most Americans lost interest in fighting those foolish wars. But what was more important was that you moved away from unipolarity into multipolarity with the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power under Vladimir Putin. And the end result is that once you were in a multipolar world after 2017, the United States had to focus on great power competition. And of course, it abandoned, in large part, its mission of trying to remake the world in its own image, because not only had it failed, but there were more important issues on the table than spreading liberal democracy. And the more important issues involved great power competition. So, as you correctly pointed out, Vuk, we've had a switch here in American foreign policy that is due largely to a change in the structure of the international system, the movement from unipolarity to multipolarity, but also it is due to the fact that liberal hegemony was a colossal failure. Instead of remaking the world in America's image, we got bogged down in the forever wars.
What, if anything, could possibly peel Moscow away at this stage or drive a wedge between China and Russia? Or must the West accept this block as a permanent or a very long-lasting, if you will, feature of the new global order?
Let me just start at the most general level. There are three great powers in the system. The United States is still the most powerful state. But the peer competitor to the United States is not Russia, it's China. China is number two, and it's not far behind the United States in terms of military power. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers. And in a world like that, it makes eminently good strategic sense for the United States to be allied with Russia and to make sure that Russia and China are not tightly tied together. They're not allies. As a result of the Ukraine war, we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And we have this situation today where Russia and China are close allies, which is not in America's strategic interest, as you noted. Now, I would argue that Trump and his lieutenants understand that this situation doesn't make sense. And I believe that what Trump wants to do is, number one, end the Ukraine war, and number two, have good relations with Moscow. He wants U.S.-Russian relations to improve so he can peel the Russians away from the Chinese. By the way, this is a situation that's similar to what Kissinger and Nixon did in 1972. You remember that well, right? In that case, we peeled China away from the Soviet Union because it made no strategic sense for us to face both China and the Soviet Union as adversaries when there was an opportunity to make China an ally of the United States. And that, of course, was accomplished after 72. And I believe that what Trump wants to do is peel Russia away from China now. Now, your question is, how likely is it that this will succeed? And my argument would be it's extremely unlikely that it's going to succeed in the foreseeable future. In the distant future, it may work. But the problem is that Trump is having an extremely difficult time ending the Ukraine war and improving relations with Russia in a meaningful way. And the reason for that is that inside the West, this is especially true in Europe, but it's also true inside the United States, there is acute Russophobia. Hatred of Russia is endemic to the governing classes in Europe and in large part in the United States. So it makes it very difficult for Trump to improve relations with Russia. Furthermore, if you're the Russians, do you trust the West? Do you trust the United States? I don't think so. And even if you trust Donald Trump, the problem that you face is Donald Trump is not forever. This is his second term as president. And after 2028, he's no longer going to be president of the United States. And his successor may be another Russophobe. So, from Russia's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to continue to have good relations with China. And of course, from China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to have close relations with Russia. So it's hard to see how we rectify uh, this strategic situation that makes no sense for the United States.
How realistic do you think is the prospect of Europe emerging as an independent pole rather than remaining a theater for great power competition outside of Europe?
Been a very powerful tendency since the Cold War ended, although you even saw evidence of it during the Cold War, to refer to Europe as if it were a single political entity, almost as if it were a state of its own. This is a mistake. Europe is comprised of a large number of sovereign states. And the reason that you could pretend that there was this political entity called Europe was because you had two institutions, NATO and the European Union, that brought the Europeans together underneath the American security umbrella. But what's happening here is that the American security umbrella is either going away completely or it's seriously weakening. And the question one then has to ask him or herself is whether this means that Europe will come closer together, that Europeans will work more closely than ever because the United States security umbrella has gone away or is significantly diminished. My argument is that the opposite will happen, that European relations will become more fractious. Having the Americans in Europe in a serious way went to great lengths to serve as a glue that kept the Europeans together. You take the American security umbrella away, and there's going to be fractious relations between European countries, and it's going to become impossible to talk about Europe as if it were a single actor. Furthermore, you do not want to underestimate the extent to which there are going to be poisonous relations between Europe on one hand and Russia on the other hand for as far as the eye can see. The catastrophic consequences of the Ukraine war cannot be underestimated. First of all, with regard to what's happened to Ukraine. This is an utter disaster for Ukraine. But furthermore, it has poisoned relations between Russia and Europe for the foreseeable future. I believe that once the shooting stops and you get a frozen conflict, relations between Europe on one side and Russia on the other side will be poisonous. And the end result will be that you will get fractures in Europe as a result of this situation with Russia. There will be countries in Europe that will want to have more friendly relations with the Russians, and there will be countries in Europe that want to have even more hostile relations with the Russians. And of course, the Russians will have very powerful incentives to exploit these divisions in Europe and sow dissension in Europe. So moving forward, I would argue that Europe is going to look less like a whole political entity than it has in the past because of, number one, the fact that the American security umbrella is either going away or is going to be significantly diminished. And number two, because of the poisonous relations between Europe and Russia that are likely to set in after the shooting stops in Ukraine.
It's very evident these days in the decoupling of high-tech supply chains, and high-tech being a big driver of global growth and of domestic economies around the world. It's a very significant thing, in my opinion. Does this thing validate the argument that high levels of economic interdependence are actually dangerous instead of stabilizing? And how much economic pain do you think the great powers are willing to absorb to supply their supply lines?
Well, a couple points here. First of all, many people believe that economic interdependence causes peace. And the argument is that economic interdependence promotes prosperity. And if countries are becoming prosperous economically, why would they dare to start a war and put an end to that prosperity? This makes no sense at all. So over past years, when I've argued that the United States and China are likely to end up in a dangerous security competition, many of my interlocutors would argue that's wrong because of all the economic interdependence between China and the United States. You'd never get a serious security competition. There's no choice, you'd get war. I used to remind people that you had a great deal of economic interdependence in Europe before World War One, but you still got World War One. So don't count on economic interdependence producing peace. So my bottom line here with regard to the war and peace question is that I don't think economic interdependence causes war, and I don't think it causes peace. I don't think it matters very much. It may matter on the margins in certain cases, but it doesn't matter very much. Now, where economic interdependence matters today, especially to the United States, is that the United States is dependent on China for certain materials. And this gives China great leverage over the United States. And what I'm talking about here is mainly rare earths and magnets, rare earth magnets. As you remember, when President Trump first came to office earlier this year in January 2025, he almost immediately decided to play hardball with China. He was talking about levying massive tariffs on China and making China dance to his tune. This did not last long because the Chinese reminded President Trump that the American economy was heavily dependent on rare earth materials and was heavily dependent on rare earth magnets. And the Chinese told President Trump in no uncertain terms that they would cut off those rare earths to the United States if the United States played hardball. And the end result is that President Trump backed off. He's no longer playing hardball with the Chinese. And that's because the Chinese have significant leverage over us. And that's because we are dependent on China. This is one of the results of economic interdependence. It's a result of these supply chains that the United States depends on, that China acts as a key player inside of. So what we're trying to do, the United States, is rectify this situation, but that's very difficult to do. So you see that in the present situation, it's not that economic interdependence has caused war or facilitated peace, but what economic interdependence has done is it's put the United States in a situation that is not good from a strategic point of view. The United States does not want to be in a situation where it depends on China for rare earths or for rare earth magnets, but that's where we are. So economic interdependence has real limits, as the United States is now finding out.
Scanning the board, the global board today, where do you see the highest risk of a hot war erupting by accident? Is Taiwan the obvious primary flashpoint, as many would say, or are we overlooking under other dangerous fault lines?
Well, let me talk about East Asia and Taiwan, and then let me go to Europe, where I think there's huge potential for trouble moving forward. First of all, with regard to East Asia, there are three major flashpoints between China and the United States in that region. The first, which you mentioned, is Taiwan, which is obviously very dangerous. The Chinese are deeply committed to getting Taiwan back. They believe that Taiwan is sacred territory and it belongs in China. So they're committed to taking Taiwan back. At the same time, there's no question that from a strategic point of view, the United States and Japan and Other countries in East Asia do not want China to take Taiwan back. The United States and Japan are deeply committed to making sure Taiwan remains independent. So you can see that Taiwan is a dangerous flashpoint for sure. But there are two other flashpoints that really worry me greatly. One is the South China Sea. The Chinese believe that the South China Sea basically belongs to them. It's not international waters, as the United States and its allies say. It's Chinese waters. So there is real potential for conflict in terms of who controls the South China Sea. And then there's the East China Sea, where these small, tiny islands, which the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and the Chinese call the Diao Islands, are disputed territory. Japan now occupies those islands, and Japan believes those islands belong to them. The Chinese disagree completely, though the Chinese are convinced that those are Chinese islands. And furthermore, you have a dispute over who controls the East China Sea. The Chinese want to dominate the East China Sea, and the Japanese don't want them to. So again, you have these three major flashpoints in East Asia: the South China Sea, the East China Sea, which of course includes the Senkaku or Diao Islands, and then of course Taiwan. But let's go to Europe. Uh, First of all, even if you solve or stop the fighting in Ukraine, you're going to end up with a frozen conflict in Ukraine. And there's always the danger that that frozen conflict will once again turn into a hot war. You'll go from a cold war to a hot war. So Ukraine by itself will remain a dangerous flashpoint in Europe. But I would argue there's six other dangerous flashpoints in Europe, which are closely related to the competition between Russia on one side and Europe and the United States on the other. And those six potential flashpoints in Europe are the Arctic, where you want to remember 7 of the 8 countries that are physically located in the Arctic are NATO countries. The Russians are outnumbered 7 to 1. And there are all sorts of potential problems that could lead to conflict in the Arctic. Then there's the Baltic Sea, then there's Kaliningrad, then there's Belarus, then there's Moldova, and then there's the Black Sea. I could tell you a story, as I'm sure you could tell me a story, about how you get a possible war between Russia on one side and one or more European countries on the other side in each of those cases. So Europe is going to remain a very dangerous place when it comes to the possibility of war for the foreseeable future, just as East Asia is going to remain a very dangerous place.